Well, listening to the video again to try to see if I have it complete, which I've come to the conclusion it's not complete. I'm just groping. I'm still groping. So I was alluding to the neon bulb creates an imbalance situation which it bleeds off electric charge, voltage, which allows for radiant energy to come in to the system and be converted into electricity at the load, and I'm incorrect. It would be converted into electricity involving the 56 grounding rods and the captor loop. The captor loop going around the electric keeper. That is an inductive coupling. We want radiant energy to convert into usable electricity because we have to pass it through a magnetic field. And that means why Clarence said the Earth has to have a strong magnetic field in its placement of the collector grounding rods, the 56 that he ended up having to use as opposed to like 10 or 20. By comparison, if like he was in a very strong geomagnetic area, but in a weak geomagnetic area, he's got to use more grounding rods. So it's not all about the number of grounding rods, it's also about that captor loop wrapped around the secondary that's going to provide the magnetic processing, the electromagnetic processing of radiant energy that's coming in through the neon bulb. The radiant energy is coming in through the neon bulb, but you can't use it because it's not electricity. It's going in the wrong direction, for one thing. And it's not electrical, let alone it's not magnetic. It's radiant. It's something else. So that's the purpose of grounding the system to either a common ground of a massive iron, magnetizable substance, or the Earth, which is already generating a magnetic field. Okay, now we're getting complicated. Better stay away from the Nazi U-boat situation for the moment. But in the case of Barbosa and Leal, Clarence's replication, the Earth is needed to process the radiant energy that's coming in through the neon bulb. So you set up a surge. It's just what the guy analyzed said. The surge is required. The neon bulb is there to protect the circuit from the surge, but the surge becomes a requirement. A requirement to run the system. Because it's bringing in radiant energy, because it's getting rid of an excess of voltage strictly at a high frequency. Well, let's forget about the frequencies. It operates at a high frequency, that's true. And that's a good thing because it's separate from the low frequency of 60 cycles that Clarence's replication is set up to operate at, or the infinite duration of a DC cycle, which is, like an infinitely long AC cycle. We just don't know when it ends. So in a sense, it's an indeterminable frequency of extra large duration if it were a DC system. In any case, it's a low frequency. And the frequency of the disruptive discharge of a neon bulb is anything but low. It's high. So it's bringing in radiant energy that's not in conflict with anything, but it has to be processed through an electromagnetic field, and that is provided by the Earth. And the only reason to have 56 versus 20 grounding rods is you have to have enough of a coupling there to do any good, based on how much magnetic field there is. So the radiant energy is going to be coursing along its course along a single wire, because radiant energy doesn't need a closed loop. A single wire is all it's needed. It was collected from the air by the free end of the, or from free space, let's just say from space, by the free end of the neon bulb wire, the one leg that wasn't attached to anything, and then brought into the system through the neon bulb and its connected other leg to the load circuit, which does get shorted to the secondary, the electric keeper, to give it a beat, a 60 cycle beat, but it also needs to be turned into full-scale electromotive force not just partially potential, by going to the actually no, well, it is a single wire though. It's two singularities of wire. It splits. It just does a Y split. One goes to the Earth. Actually, one goes to the Earth, but it first has to pass inductively beyond or through the electric keeper. Twice. Coming and going. Which, when you think about it, accommodates an AC system, because an AC system has to take both halves of the cycle into consideration. So that captor loop takes care of that. Takes care of the bidirectionality that needs to be imposed upon the radiant energy. But it does have to be processed through a magnetic field, and that is supplied by the Earth. And if the Earth is not strong enough in a magnetic field, then we need more grounding rods. Why? Why is that? To match the electromotive force coming out of the 4 grounding rods out of the neutral side of the plug number 1 of the AC inverter in Clarence's replication. So we're given a signature, an electrostatic signature that we have to match in the transformation of radiant energy into becoming the source of energy that's going to power our load and the rest of the circuitry, including the top load. Sort of. Actually, we don't have to supply it to the top load because that's already being supplied by the AC inverter. Anyway, well, for starters, okay, whatever. So we have a signature to adhere to of how much voltage that sounds a little odd. Wait a minute. The voltage being supplied electrostatically by the neutral of plug number 1 is a resistance. It's an electrostatic resistor. And the radiant energy has to be converted into normal electricity in such a way to match. We have to literally create a matching voltage out of the radiant energy. And we're not getting it from the neutral coming from plug number 1. We're just getting a signature coming from the neutral of plug number 1 of what we want to convert the radiant energy into. And in order to do that, we have to have sufficient magnetic field to do that, to match it. If the voltage of the neutral coming from plug number 1 were to be any lower, then we could accommodate a weaker magnetic field. Or anywhere else in the system, less efficiency of drawing in radiant energy. But as it is, it's 115 volts that we're looking at supplying our load with. And if the geomagnetic field should be inadequate to accommodate maybe 10 or 20 grounding rods, then we need more because of that diluted magnetic field. It won't provide enough voltage. It won't convert the radiant energy into sufficient voltage to match the voltage coming out of the 4 grounding rods. So the relationship between the 4 grounding rods and the 56 grounding rods is an electrostatic relationship, but that's not to say that we don't need a magnetic field. We need it because we're converting radiant energy into usable electromagnetic energy. So we need the geomagnetic field to be as strong as possible to reduce the number of grounding rods that we'll need to process that radiant energy within any given moment of time. Because our load is demanding load at all times, moment by moment. We've got to match it fast enough. And that's where the strength of the geomagnetic field comes into play. Because there's no limit to how much radiant energy we can bring in, so long as our circuitry can handle the consequence of that radiant energy being fully converted into electromagnetic energy and not frying the system. That's the beauty of a disruptive discharge, is that it has the potential for bringing in an infinite quantity of radiant energy. But there are consequences. We have to be prepared to deal with the consequences immediately by having the circuitry set up adequately to accommodate that influx of radiant energy based on what kind of voltage we're trying to convert it to. So to convert that radiant energy into adequate voltage requires a strong enough magnetic field surrounding the 56 grounding rods, which still sounds counterintuitive, because voltage is not magnetism. Oh, wait a minute. We're trying to create a symmetry here between the four grounding rods and the 56 grounding rods. We're trying to create a symmetry of a transformative symmetry of radiant energy, so that the symmetry of that transformation of radiant energy is symmetrical between its magnetic field component and its electric field component. So unlike any other consideration elsewhere in the circuitry that might may purposefully attempt to create asymmetry, here we're trying to create symmetry because we're powering the load. The load has to have that symmetry to power itself. That's why our standard conventional circuits drain the source, because they're symmetrical circuits. They obey the second law of thermodynamics and don't think about anything else. Because we get our electrical engineers to focus on the load, the characteristics of the load, and they try to engineer the source to supply all the energy exclusively for the load without it coming from anywhere else. And so consequently, they look at the load, the symmetry of the load, and they try to match the symmetry of the source to match the symmetry of the load. But in a complicated system in which you're trying to reference energy from outside the system, you have to use asymmetry to get it, but you have to use symmetry to transform it before you get to use it. So that quotation from somebody at the Over Unity Forum or the Energetic Forum, I can't remember which, that said that it's a two-stage process. First you have to collect or get the radiant energy, and then you have to convert it by passing it through an electromagnetic field. Or did he say a magnetic field? See, now I can't remember which. But the consequence of that conversion has to be a symmetrical balance between the electric component and the magnetic component of that transformation that has occurred to that radiant energy, or else you won't be able to. It won't all be there to supply the load. Whatever portion is too much is wasted. So in a sense, that might be happening here too. So then we have to create an excess, and whatever symmetrical balance there is left over is all we get to utilize, and the excess, the system just has to deal with that excess. But it's only the balanced portion that we get to utilize. And that's going to come about based on our magnetic coupling to the Earth, or I should say, no, the electrostatic coupling to the Earth, based on the capacitance. You know, the grounding rods are vertical, so they're coupled to a flow that's happening horizontally, going across them at a perpendicular. Not coming out from the center of the Earth, but going along the surface of the Earth, encircling the Earth along just underneath the surface, 10 feet, let's say, within the uppermost 10 feet of the surface of the Earth, or 8 feet in the case of the grounding rod that Clarence specified for use. But they're all serially connected to each other, and they're spaced 3 feet apart, which indicates to me that it has nothing to do with magnetism, even though they're iron rods, copper-coated. I fail to see how that can pick up a magnetic field, even though it has to be immersed in one of a strong enough design. because its relationship with the 4 grounding rods is an electrostatic relationship, and that electrostatic field relationship has to be counterpoised to the geomagnetic field, and that counterpoising between those two fields, whatever is equivalent between them, is going to be the net power, the net wattage that's going to come out of the system, out of the Earth to power the load. So it's slightly complicated, but not too complicated. You know, why all those elements are needed. But up in the area of the neon bulb, we literally create asymmetry to bring radiant energy into the system. Now, why go to all this trouble? People used to think that Tesla was pumping energy into the Earth and ringing it like a bell until he got enough energy built up that it would just spill out. Yet, it doesn't look that way to me. Not at all. He's drawing it out of both the Earth and the air, but it's different what he's drawing. From the air, he's not drawing electricity, he's drawing radiant energy. From the Earth, he's drawing his standard electromagnetic force to power the load. So it's 2 draws taking place from 2 different sources. And the radiant is the first step of the processing, while the Earth is the second step of processing that radiant energy. And that might be why an AC system is so effective, because we've got an alternation of direction implied. Oh, wait a second. No. Radiant energy goes in the direction opposed to electromotive force. So, or electromagnetic, the electric fields and magnetic fields. So you don't really need an AC system. Now I'm beginning to question the honesty of the statement that the Barbosa-Leel system can power either a DC or an AC load, because to think that means that the Barbosa and Leel circuitry can be anything other than AC in the majority of its characteristic and still have a neon bulb operate is beyond me. I don't see how that can happen. AC seems to be the only way it would operate as, because otherwise the neon bulb would not. There would be no there would be no spark happening in the neon bulb, I would think. Oh, wait a minute. No, a DC. Depends which way the thing is running. If the DC current is running it may have to be in only one direction. If it's running such that the DC current is running in, well, no, wait a minute. It almost doesn't matter, because the neon bulb is a single wire connection. So, alright, so any voltage is going to create a surge and thus a discharge through the neon bulb. It's just a question of whether or not there's enough. You know what we might need? See, now that's what Clarence might have been referring to. The motor that Tesla had installed in his Pierce Arrow demonstration was an AC motor, because it's more efficient. If it had been a DC motor, then and only then would we need an aluminum collector plate anywhere on the, poised on the, protruding out of the Pierce-era car, instead of the antenna, and not along with it. If we forget about a radio, the use of a radio, just forget, take out the radio and take out the connection to the antenna, so that doesn't complicate the matter. In terms of the neon bulb's connection to the air, there's only two types, and a plate would be needed in any situation in which the neon bulb does not have sufficient voltage to light up. So you increase the likelihood of it lighting up by increasing the surface area of the air contact antenna beyond a mere wire antenna to become a very large, broad surface area, such as what Clarence had suggested, a rectangular aluminum plate on the back end of the car, he suggested. But that's only if you don't have enough voltage, which would be the case if it were a DC system. Neon bulbs are not designed to necessarily light up. And I'm still questioning whether or not they light up at all in a DC, powered by a DC voltage as it is. But certainly increasing capacitance, capacitance on that free end of the antenna would help light up the bulb. Because without the bulb lighting up, the whole system won't work. Why is that? Oh, forgetting the fact that it's disruptive, it's a discharge, which means it forces the system to lose energy, to lose voltage, and to bleed it out into the air. It forces it to lose energy. To lose voltage, to lose voltage. Which might be ultimately what radiant energy is anyway, is the inverse of electric field. The inverse of an electrostatic field might be what radiant energy is. An amperage is the counter-opposing flow of the two. The volts pointed one way, and the radiant energy pointing the other way, and so the true flow of amperage is bidirectional at all times. One direction just happens to be the electric field, and the other is the radiant field. No, I'm sorry. One direction is the magnetic field, oriented according to the electric field, while the opposite direction of flow is the is the radiant energy. What did I say? The radiant energy strictly complements the voltage, not the amperage, because the amperage is the blending between the two. Well, if that's the case, then radiant energy doesn't flow. No, wait a second. So it's not complementing voltage then. It's complementing the magnetic field that's coursing through the wire in the form of amperage. It's just oriented differently with respect to the voltage polarity of the electric field. Oh dear. Okay, the radiant energy is inside the magnetic keeper, going in the opposite direction to the amperage that's also going in the magnetic keeper endlessly. Wait a second here. What's going on in the electric keeper then? Same thing, only the lens effect takes effect. Lens takes effect, but not so in the magnetizable magnetic keeper, the transformer core, toroidal transformer core. So any boost or any transformation of radiant energy entering the system and going into the toroids is merely there to help maintain the energy level of the circuitry, but not necessarily supply the load. That's coming from the earth, for the most part, to make up the difference. Because the load is greater than what the supply can supply, so it's got to come from somewhere else. But the circuitry needs to be powered as well as the load does. You know, it consumes power too. So that's why we have two magnetic keepers, or two areas that process the radiant energy. The toroids are one, and the earth is the other. Still doesn't... Oh dear. In a sense, the radiant energy is going to be processed by the toroids first, because that's the easiest place to maintain voltage of the load circuit and to maintain voltage of the electric keeper. Because that's something the magnetic keeper doesn't possess, is voltage. It transfers it between the primary and the secondary coils in the form of magnetism, but that doesn't mean it has it itself. I don't think a magnetizable iron is going to store volts. It's merely going to store amperage and radiant energy going in opposite directions. But yet, you would think if they're going in opposite directions, it would supply volts. But if we can't harvest it, well, there's no reference because it loops upon itself. Oh. Right. No, it has volts. No, it's there. Everything is there. We just don't harvest the volts from the magnetic keeper. So we transfer it over to the electric keeper, and now we can harvest the volts through the shunt, the one-wire shunt between the secondary and the load circuit. And we also harvest the vector, the direction of flow, through the captor loop, which is important because we have to keep the load power in sync, in phase with the rest of the system, whatever it may be, DC or AC, doesn't make a difference. It has to, the vector has to stay in alignment. So that's the purpose of the captor loop, is to take care of vector, the direction. So the toroids can be magnetized either by the AC inverter, in Clarence's case, or by the energy coming in through, firstly through the radiant energy coming in through the neon bulb, and then secondly, once it's converted, it can convert itself in both locations, through the earth or through the toroids, or both actually. But without the earth, all you're going to do is maintain the circuitry at idle, and you're not going to be able to power a load without draining the source, obviously. So that's why we have two magnetic keepers. The difference being that the magnetic keeper of the circuitry, the toroids, are fixed by how much energy they're going to process. They're only so much energy in, so much energy out. That's a closed system. And that is enough to idle the circuitry, to power the circuitry. But to power the load, we need the earth as a second magnetic keeper with a very special connection to it. You notice the grounding rods are not coils of wire, such as they are, the primary and the secondary looping around the toroid within the circuitry. They're just two groups of grounding rods, which is truly bizarre. But they're at right angles to the flow that's happening horizontally through the earth, and that's exactly what a coil of wire does. And inductive coupling is at right angles. That's right. It's literally at right angles, and that's how we induce movement of a current in a wire when we move that wire at right angles through a magnetic field. We set up a voltage, an electric field voltage, in the wire. And the movement of the wire induces movement of that amperage. But because it's at right angles, then we start to wrap it at right angles around the wire to make an inductive loop, such as the Kaptor loop. And now we've got a coil, or a coil on the toroids, the primary coil or the secondary coil. But in the case of the grounding rods, they have to be vertical current set, because they're at right angles to the flow, the magnetic flow, which is amperage, that's running horizontally across just underneath the surface of the earth that we're trying to capture. So that is the equivalent of a coil. Sort of. Except it's a broken coil. Yet it is at a perpendicular. So well, if the Kaptor loop does more than just maintain the vector in phase with the supply, the vector of the source supplying the load, the source coming from outside the circuit, it could very well be that there's no radiant energy to speak of coming in through the neon bulb so much as it simply sets up disruption. And to do so, it has to have a bleed out to the air, but it's the disruption that matters, because that's going to irritate the earth. I'm really groping here. Irritate the earth to give up whatever energy, quantity of energy we want. And it's through the Kaptor loop that the radiant energy gets converted into usable format, because that Kaptor loop is an electromagnetically powered coil, powered by the secondary, the electric keeper. And the voltage is maintained by the shunt connection between the other side of the electric keeper and the other side of the load. Yeah, radiant energy only needs a single wire, so it's actually coming in through the earth. It's coming in through the air too, but not in any appreciable quantity. The main thing coming from the direction of the air end of the circuitry is disruption. The element of disruption, the characteristic of disruption. So the circuit is providing, the AC inverter in Clarence's replication is providing symmetry of form on the one hand, because it's a circuit. We've got to run off of something. So it runs off of symmetry, but it's the disruption that causes the radiant energy to come in to the system. So we'll be leaking energy out both ends, both through the air and the earth, and it's the earth that we're going to acquire most of the influx of radiant energy to make up the difference. Which means the more grounding rods you have at the 56 side of the equation, the more loss is possible. It's a voltage loss that we're looking for. It's increased surface area. And the spacing sets up that surface area. It's like a grid. That's why it has to be 3 feet apart and not greater. because it's a field that we're creating, a voltage field to leak out voltage into the earth. The earth, not the air, because it's the earth that has the geomagnetic field to create a back EMF within the earth that's going to kick out of the earth and into the system in the form of radiant energy. So back EMF is a funny thing. It's not back EMF, but it's this is strange. Now we're using voltage to evince an eruption of radiant energy in the location of the 56 grounding rods. That is weird. But the disruption is on the side of the 56, not on the side of the 4 grounding rods. Those are symmetrical. Those have the 60 cycle sine wave coming out of the neutral of plug number 1. So, of Clarence, of the schematic of the Clarence's replication. So the Earth makes up the difference. There has to be symmetry, right? The Earth is always, nature is always going to want to create balance where there's ever an imbalance, and we create an imbalance, and the Earth makes up the difference. So we create a disruption on the 56 rod side. There's no disruption on the 4 rod side. And the Earth takes a look at it and says, you know what, I got to supply disruption to make up the difference. And so it does, and it does so in the form of radiant energy. So it's not back EMF, it's just counter to the disruption that's coming out of the circuit and going into the Earth, which would imply an amperage. But I guess it's not. It's strictly a voltage situation. Well, it's electron leakage, as they say, as opposed to strict amperage. Electron migration, as they say. You know, it's like 1 or 2 electrons. You know, because everything's relativistic as it is. When you have a voltage leakage, of course, there's going to be amperage flow, just not a whole lot. It doesn't need to be. Well, So the radiant energy comes in at the same disruptive frequencies that the voltage was leaked out through the 56 grounding rods, and then it passes through the electron, the Kaptor loop, and gets converted into standard EMF, or electromagnetism, I should say. Where did the monopole come into all of this? Oh yeah, that's another thing. Well, I failed to specify that the monopole occurs only in the realm of high frequencies, in the realm of the disruptive discharge frequencies. It does not occur in the realm of the 60 cycles that's coming out of the AC inverter. So, strictly speaking, it's not a monopole. Relativistically speaking, it is. And it's that relativistic portion that creates the dipole with the load. So that the transformation of radiant energy has somewhere to go to be used. Does that make sense?
But all I can say is I'm groping. A lot of groping. Because it's complicated. Now we got radiant energy to deal with. And monopoles and dipoles. Oh, good grief. And frequencies. As well as standard electrodynamics. Good grief. And I thought this was going to be simple. No. No wonder I keep groping.